Let's play a game. Name the most popular fantasy series you can think of. 3, 2, 1. Okay, let's say it together, Lord of the Rings. Now, let's make things more interesting. Name the second most popular fantasy series you can think of. 3, 2, 1, go. Now this is where things get fun. We've got the predictable but well-earned shouts for A Song of Ice and Fire, and I think I'm hearing a solid amount of Discworld in the mix too. And of course, I'm pretty sure I heard some pretty loud screaming in the back for Earthsea. But unless I'm very much mistaken, a huge chunk of people out there probably went with a certain epic, some might say monolithic, and definitely divisive series, The Wheel of Time. A sprawling 14-book saga filled with magic, prophecy, and enough skirt smoothing and braid tugging to power a village. The Wheel of Time is one of the most ambitious fantasy series ever written. It's been called the heir to Lord of the Rings and the ultimate slow burn epic mixed with a good amount of middle school drama / love triangles / love square, and depending on who you ask, either an absolute masterpiece or a bloated mess. But no matter where you stand, you cannot deny its impact. Now, when I was younger, I remember the very first time I saw someone at school carrying around this book with this blue-clad woman next to an absolute mountain of a man, and I spent an entire class just staring at that title, The Wheel of Time, letting my imagination run wild, trying to guess what kind of story it could possibly tell. And the moment I finally got my hands on my own copy, I was absolutely hooked. But over the years, life caught up with me, and I wasn't able to keep up with the series through all of its extreme highs and deeply tragic lows. So recently, I got curious what's been going on with it. Well, it turns out quite a bit. From the dramatic and divisive ending, which almost didn't happen at all, and of course the giant elephant in the room, the Amazon adaptation, which has sparked, let's say, strong opinions. But beyond that, there are some wild twists and turns in this series' history, including adaptations that I guarantee even the most die-hard fans have probably never heard of. So in this video, we're going to dive into it all. What the Wheel of Time is actually about, the journey of its mini books and adaptations, and finally where everything stands today to explore whatever happened to the Wheel of Time. Hi everyone, my name is Otto and welcome to Exits Examines. In this channel, we will be exploring series, franchises, and more after their prime time has seemingly come to an end. So if diving into the sprawling, prophecy-laden world of the Wheel of Time has you itching for some legendary battles of your own, let me introduce you to a game that delivers exactly that, but on the high seas. World of Warships is a free-to-play naval combat game where you command some of history's most iconic warships, strategize against real players, and dominate the oceans in intense tactical battles. And although you can't play as Rand or Matt, you can play as another legendary figure, the Headless Horseman, bringing with him a cursed ship that will strike fear into your enemies and presumably all dark friends. Now, I love history and I love strategy games, so I was thrilled to work with World of Warships on this. And if you, like me, needed a break from reading the insanely long Wheel of Time series, this is not the worst way to do it. Now, Wargaming actually gave me an exclusive code, Headless, that unlocks 7 days of premium account time, 1.5 million credits, and of course the Headless Horseman Commander and ship skin. And if you really want to help me out, use the invite code Headless and set sail with the most haunted fleet in World of Warships. Okay, back to Wheel of Time. And heads up, there will be minor spoilers sprinkled throughout the video, although nothing groundbreaking. So how does one even begin to describe the Wheel of Time? Known for possibly being the greatest American fantasy series of all time, it is the very definition of an epic. It's a philosophy, an immense feat of world building, and probably above all else, it's a commitment. And the best way to describe it might be as a wild mashup of the Lord of the Rings and middle school drama. But it's also so much more than that. We're talking about 14 books coming over 4 million words and enough named characters to fill a small city. And yet, for all its complexity, The Wheel of Time remains one of the most beloved and enduring works in fantasy, and it honestly makes sense. Robert Jordan's magnus opus is an absurdly ambitious undertaking, and yet, even today, if you look around the fantasy landscape, it remains an absolute behemoth in the genre. So the question is, of course, why? What makes this absolute unit of a series stand out so much even a whopping 30 years after its original release? Well, as you can probably imagine, breaking down everything in the Wheel of Time would probably require a 10-hour video, 1 bottle of whiskey, 2 whiteboards, and probably your very own sangria. If you know, you know. Because sure, there are epic fantasy series out there, but the Wheel of Time scale and scope is truly titanic. But it's kind of deceiving, because at first glance, the Wheel of Time looks like pretty much just another classic hero's journey. I mean, you've got a chosen one, a dark lord, and an epic quest to save the world. Standard fantasy, right? Well, yes, that is true that the story revolves around the classic good versus evil, but the deeper you dive in, you'll see that opposed to some fantasy series where the fight between good and evil is added almost as an afterthought or by necessity of the genre, the entire idea of light and dark, balance, and the binaries of existence are central to what's being explored in A Wheel of Time. Now, I'm not sure if it's necessarily a deconstruction, but it definitely examines them, and throw on top of that some genuinely great moments of empathy, and there is a lot of good stuff going on here. And look, if all of that has you bored, rolling your eyes, don't worry, there's also tons of bad magic, genuinely epic scale battles like some of the biggest in fantasy, and that's not even to mention it's built on some truly excellent world building. Now, I think for a lot of people, the reason they love fantasy is to explore and get lost in a fantastical, believable, immersive world, and as far as like deep world building goes, the Wheel of Time is it. Every city, every culture, every faction feels so lived in and incredibly fleshed out. From the Aiel warrior clans to the political machinations of noble houses, constantly scheming to one-up each other, you really get a sense that all these societies each have their own histories, customs, and struggles. And they don't just exist to fill space, they play a huge role in the story, even if the main characters never directly interact with them. So as far as what's actually going on here, at the heart of this world building and the world is, well, the Wheel of Time. So what is a Wheel of Time? Well, the universe has these giant repeating cycles, with every soul in the world being its own thread in this giant weave, and throughout the series you'll keep hearing this saying: the wheel weaves as the wheel wills, because if you couldn't guess from the description, fate and the pattern, which is the grand tapestry that weaves the entire world, is at the core of the series. Now, of course, it's not that simple, because it's fantasy, baby, and of course we've got one huge force that's trying to stop all of it. The guy who has many names, all of which sound pretty evil. We got Father of Lies, Lord of the Grave, or just the good old classic, the Dark One. However you want to call him, he is the primordial force of evil in the universe and been around since the beginning, and his whole bag, if you will, is to break the cycle. Now this brings us to what every good fantasy world building needs, which is of course a good old ancient cataclysmic event. Thousands of years ago, humanity was living in a golden age called the Age of Legends, with technology and magic at their absolute peak. Now, the magic here really is unique in a sense that it's split by gender. Sidene for men and Sidar for women are the two halves of the one power, and although they're connected, crucially they work differently. Channeling, aka magic, is all about weaving the one power into threads, and the way you arrange those threads determines what happens. The possibilities are pretty much endless if you know what you're doing, and can also be existentially terrifying, like Balefire, for example, which literally erases your thread backwards in time from the pattern itself. Now, magic might sound OP, and yes, it is, but there are a number of limitations. For example, like how even 13 of the weakest magic users could overpower even the strongest. And there's also all types of artifacts, with the Sangreal being pretty critical to the plot, and essentially it allows channelers to use more of the one power, like enough to potentially level worlds, which, as you can imagine, might be a bit of an issue. Speaking of, let's go back to the timeline. Now, back in the Age of Legends, it was basically a utopia. The male and female parts of magic were unified, and people could do incredible things. But you best believe our guy, the Dark One, did not like that. And due to his meddling, the male users of the One power kind of had a bad day at the office, and to make an extremely long story short, they went completely insane and, well, this is awkward, laid waste to the entire world, boiling oceans, killing countless innocents, and this was appropriately named the Breaking of the World. Now, after this, we're talking about thousands of years, society became regressed, very much akin to the quote-unquote Dark Ages in the real world, except in the Wheel of Time, magic still exists, but under the current Aes Sedai, who differ greatly from those before the breaking. The present-day Aes Sedai are only female. No more men because they are deemed too dangerous, and the Aes Sedai are organized into what is known as the White Tower, hunting down and stilling men who can channel, aka making them so they can't use magic anymore. Originally, the White Tower is seen as a pillar of strength and stability in the world, but as the series unfolds, it becomes clear that the White Tower is far from perfect. It's broken, divided, and even childish at times, filled with politics, ambition, and infighting. And this is interesting because it's kind of a reflection of the world at large, because you better believe that the Dark One is still out there, and although he's still sealed away for now, his taint has seeped into the world, and we've got dark friends all over the place, and you get a sense that the world is kind of slowly coming undone. Now, what is a Dark Friend, you ask? Well, pretty self-explanatory, but basically agents of the Dark Lord. But if you really want to insult someone at dinner, call them a Dark Friend, because if by the light someone calls me a Dark Friend, woo, you know I am not standing for it. Anyway, all of this brings us to the present day, and like all good fantasy stories, it all comes down to a prophecy. At the heart of everything is the ancient foretelling that the dragon, the male champion of the light, will be reborn to face the Dark One in the last battle, the final showdown at the end of the age. So, who is the dragon this time around? Well, that leads us nicely into one of the Wheel of Time's greatest strengths, which is its characters. Because sure, you can have all the intricate world building, deep lore, and metaphysical cosmic wheels you want, none of it is going to hit unless you've got a bunch of chaotic, crush-obsessed, occasionally infuriating characters running around. And the Wheel of Time delivers hard on that. Now, as you might imagine, you spend so much time with these characters that it's hard not to feel a certain way about them, and they very realistically change so much, often in ways that are hard to recognize from their first appearances. And you get a sense that they feel the weight of this, especially when they start to realize how much they have changed, and they even mourn their own change in a way. We get to see their internal struggles from their own POVs, or interestingly enough, from other characters around them, and it's not uncommon at all for people's favorite character in the series to be one they initially couldn't stand. Now, there are essentially three main characters, with also a bunch of important secondary characters throughout here. And yes, this is a Chosen One story, and there's, well, you know, a Chosen One, but don't think for a second that this means one character gets all the spotlight. In fact, the so-called Chosen One is more often than not even the most POV'd character in many of the books. And speaking of that, it's actually fascinating how the POVs switch from one book to another. If you look at the statistical breakdown of POV chapters, there's an interesting shift in gender POVs across the series. It starts as more male, but is more female as the series progresses. And this is notable because we'll talk about it more later, but gender is an important part of this series. And if you're curious, I'll link a great breakdown of some of the statistics of the series by Barnes & Noble below. But enough about boring stats, let me tell you about who these characters are. And heads up, mild spoilers ahead, but again, nothing huge. First up is our golden boy Rand, who has one of the most insane arcs of the series and maybe in fantasy. He has a penchant for getting physically and emotionally maimed on a regular basis. His highs are ridiculously high and his lows are, well, absolute rock bottom. He has to navigate this huge transition from being a regular guy to the literal weight of the world on his shoulders. And of course, he jumps up to insane power levels, but Jordan does an excellent job of always humanizing him. Whether it's the claustrophobia from the infamous box sequence, you always feel like he earns everything he's gained through pain. He goes through some huge character shifts, sometimes for the better and sometimes definitely not, and it's the first time I've seen a Chosen One arc deal so much with the main character character struggling to be the chosen one throughout the entire series. Now, if all that sounds a bit too serious, let me introduce you or reintroduce you to Matt, a fan favorite for good reason. If I had to sum him up in one sentence, I'd probably say he's a walking D&D character who somehow found himself in a high fantasy story. You know how some characters in movies or TV shows have this one defining trait that makes them instantly recognizable? Maybe it's like a tick or a magical artifact or a weird pet or something. Well, Matt is like if someone decided to cram 30 of those traits into one person. He's a gambler, a genius tactician, randomly speaks an ancient language, gets cursed by an evil knife, has a magical medallion that repels magic, and by the way is responsible for inventing this world's cannons, all while sauntering off to the inn to gamble and pick up chicks. He's quintessentially roguish, but under the surface extremely serious and loyal, whether or not he even realizes it. And this kind of duality of his character is really greatly encapsulated by the famous boot scene. Quote, "I have nothing against nobles," Matt said, straightening his coat. "I just don't fancy being one myself." "Why is that then?" Matt sat for a moment. Why was it? Finally, he looked down at his foot, then replaced his boot. "Boots," Matt said with a nod, tying his laces. "The poorest folks only have one pair. Easy choice. A man like me might have 3. And nobles?" "Talmain's has 40 bloody pairs. Boots for kings, boots for lords, boots for rainy days, for summer, winter, even ones for just walking to the privy." "I see. So you're using boots as a metaphor for the onus of responsibility placed upon the aristocracy." "Metaphor for," Matt scowled, "bloody ashes, woman. This isn't a metaphor for anything. It's just boots." End quote. Now, sadly, I can't go into every character, but just know that they all have their moments and incredible growth. Perrin is part of the trifecta with Rand and Matt and has some truly standout moments too. Moraine is the catalyst for most of what happens in the series, and Lan, her warder, which are elite warriors bonded to Aes Sedai, has some of the most hype moments in the series. Then of course we've got the girls, Egwene, Nynaeve, and Elaine, whose story takes up a huge portion of the series. They each have their own incredible growth, and they're probably some of the most divisive characters, with Nynaeve being a prime example of this. She's stubborn, a fighter, and extremely proud mixed with a little bit of insecurity, which results in some truly hilarious moments like where she tries her absolute best to apologize to a hungover Matt, but ends up trying to strangle him instead. And if all of that sounds like a lot, well, slap yourself in the face and remember that these are just the main characters. There are tons and tons and tons of side characters, each with their own sweeping epic arcs, with Lanfear and Loghain, real standouts and fascinating characters in their own right. And even if not all the characters are as multifaceted, one of the best parts of the Wheel of Time is how characters represent different cultures and ideas and are used as really great ways to build the world. So we got a massive world, a huge amount of characters, and this all sounds like it could easily turn into a hot mess, especially when you consider that the entire amount of time that actually passes in the books isn't that much time at all. And the time that is here is packed with intense change, personal growth, and huge battles. But although this series very easily could have fallen apart under the sheer weight of its scale for various reasons which we'll talk about later, I'm happy to say that everything mostly does tie together quite nicely as far as endings go. And speaking of, there are climaxes and then there are climaxes. The final book in the Wheel of Time is pure adrenaline from start to finish. It's one of the most intense, high-stakes showdowns I've ever read. There is so much going on, it's hard to keep track of it all. And the scale of the battle is insane, and maybe one of the largest explained in so much detail I've ever seen in fantasy. But of course, it's more than just an actual battle, because the final confrontation is a clash of ideologies and a philosophical showdown, with the final words in it being some of the most powerful lines in the entire series. But it's not just the ending that is sheer hype, and there are huge moments in here throughout. Take the Great Hunt and the Dragon Reborn, for example. There are some moments where I just sat back and thought, oh shit, they're really doing this, and we're only at book 3 of 14. Okay, let's go. Add on top of that this series has some of the most badass lines I've ever read. From Rand's simple, "Try me, Fade," or Nynaeve's, "I'll have no more of this," before incinerating some dark friends. Now, the writing itself has its fair share of ups and downs, but throughout it all, there's this unique, colorful language that makes the world feel so alive. I'll definitely admit I found myself muttering blood and bloody ashes or by the light under my breath when I missed a train. And of course, we cannot talk about the Wheel of Time without addressing the romance. Oh boy, there are a lot of romances, some of which are compelling and others, well, they exist. Pretty much every character in the series gets a romance arc at some point, whether it makes sense or not. We're talking about love triangles, love squares. Sometimes it feels like everyone's falling in love just by making eye contact. Characters who've barely spoken to one another suddenly cannot stop thinking about each other, and entire chapters get devoted to them agonizing over it. It can be kind of exhausting and, yeah, a little off-putting to some readers. But here's the thing, Jordan is going somewhere with this. Even if sometimes it feels like he's just shipping characters out for the drama, there's a bigger theme at play, especially when it comes to gender. The books are constantly pointing out the differences between men and women, and sometimes it can definitely read a little like, ugh, typical men doing X, or oh my god, women are so confusing doing X, and sure, some of that can definitely be cringy, but under the surface, there is an actual point being made. One of these series' core ideas is that men and women are strongest when they work together, and when you take a step back, you start to see that all these exaggerated gender differences are being used to explore how balance and cooperation are necessary. That theme of binaries, male and female, light and dark, fate and free will runs through everything, and you'll see plenty of longtime readers say that these books help them understand or empathize with people of different genders in real life. Even the stuff that seems black and white at first, like light versus dark, turns out to be way more complicated than it looks at first glance. Not all of these so-called good guys are actually good, with some of them believing in less than ideal things like slavery, and on the flip side, even some dark friends get surprisingly human moments. You start to realize that the series isn't just playing with classic fantasy tropes, it's kind of picking them apart. And the more you read, the more you see how Jordan's actually flipping around a lot of typical fantasy conventions. Take the chosen one trope. In Wheel of Time, there is a reluctance and tension, which is part of what makes the story feel so much more grounded. Even if, yes, sometimes the execution, specifically around gender, can be a little heavy-handed or over the top, but the ideas underneath is great stuff. Stuff like coming to terms with who you are, learning hubris as a leader, and how to accept responsibility. All which are summed up in great and simple quotes like the famous, quote, "Duty is heavier than a mountain, death lighter than a feather." So who could have written such a wildly ambitious, sprawling, and vast series? Well, none other than Robert Jordan, and as you might expect, the guy's life is just as fascinating. Before he was a fantasy legend, he was actually a helicopter gunner in Vietnam, and he ended up getting injured, and while recovering apparently read a lot of fantasy, but apparently was not impressed, allegedly throwing one of the books across the room in frustration, saying he could do better than that. And yeah, he definitely did, although it's not like he started immediately with the Wheel of Time. He was also one of the writers for Conan the Barbarian, interestingly enough. Not the original ones by Howard, of course, but some of the better ones when Tor was putting out Conan stories. Now, he did, of course, acknowledge the influence of The Lord of the Rings, especially in The Eye of the World, and we have to remember that when Wheel of Time came out, fantasy was basically stuck in the shadow of The Lord of the Rings. Now, there were, of course, a ton of other influences thrown in The Wheel of Time, with a lot of classics and myths. For example, a ton of names in the series and people are influenced by Arthurian legend. But here's the thing, as with everything that's great, not everything is perfect. The Wheel of Time has faced its fair share of criticism over the years, and honestly, some of it is totally fair. It's kind of the king of, it's a good series, but. And trust me, there are a lot of big buts. First off, the length of the series is a discussion unto itself, which we'll talk about later, but even putting that aside, some of the writing can feel very tedious or redundant at times. Like, is this really necessary? For instance, there are famously over 2,000 named characters in this series. I mean, I know it's an epic, but come on. And then, as for the writing itself, Jordan can get very descriptive about things at times. Characters endlessly smoothing their skirts, hurts, and it's kind of become a running joke in the fan base. Plus, the POV shifts can be incredibly jarring. One moment you're in the middle of something intense and hype-worthy, and then boom, you're yanked to a completely different character doing something low stakes. It definitely messes with the flow a bit. And then, of course, what you'll see time and time again is talk about the dreaded SLOG in the book series, which brings us to discussing, well, what actually makes up this series. So, what actually makes up the Wheel of Time? Well, strap the in. We're talking about 4 million words of juicy fantasy goodness, and to put that insane number in context, the King James Bible is around 700,000 words long. So you could read the entire Bible multiple times over before you finish the Wheel of Time. If you're listening to the audiobooks, you're looking at an average of 32 hours per book, which is roughly 2 weeks of nonstop listening just to get through the whole thing. For some people, that's a dream come true. A massive, sprawling fantasy epic that just keeps going and going. A world to live in for months, if not years. And for others, that's a brick wall of commitment, an Everest of reading that makes them nope right out of the series. And to be honest, both reactions are completely valid. But what makes the Wheel of Time truly insane isn't just the sheer length, it's the wild ride it takes you on. And I don't just mean the story itself. The publication history is just as chaotic, messy, and legendary. Some books in the series are absolute masterpieces, and some are, well, not. So let me shut up and actually break it down. In totality, there are 14 books spanning quite literally decades. Now, obviously the story is sequential, so you pretty much need to read the thing in order. If you start halfway through, you'll be completely lost. But I think it's important to note here that if you do decide to make the bold and brave decision to plunge into the series, A, I commend you, and B, no matter what your feelings are on the first book, you should push through for at least a couple more. You'll see a ton of people recommend to read at least the first 3. And this is because the first book, The Eye of the World, is not really a good measure of what the series is about, because Jordan was leaning heavily into Tolkien, and it's not until the second or third book that the series really comes into its own. In particular, book 2, The Great Hunt, where Jordan starts writing the story he actually wanted to tell. The world gets way bigger, and it was probably the moment for a ton of readers when the Wheel of Time light bulb went off in their heads and they started picking up what Jordan was throwing down. Now, although The Great Hunt is a highlight, and there are a lot of real highlights in here, as you can imagine for a series as long-running as this, well, they can't all be winners. And if you've even brushed against the orbits of the Wheel of Time, you probably heard whispers of the dreaded SLOG. It's one of the most infamous slowdowns in all of fantasy literature, a mid-series drag that tested the patience of even the most dedicated fans. Now, let's be clear. The SLOG books aren't bad in the sense that they ruin the series, but they grind the pacing to a halt, especially if you were reading the books as they were being released. Imagine waiting years for the next installment only to be handed something just kind of sluggish, which basically didn't substantially move the plot forward. Just a slow, grinding trudge through the world. But it is important to say that now that all the books are out, the slog isn't quite as painful. It's just the slow middle section that eventually pays off in the later books, and it's nothing compared to the hellscape of waiting that A Song of Ice and Fire fans are trapped in right now. But best believe when things snap back, they really snap back. In Book 11, Knife of Dreams, the pacing ramps up. Major plot lines start getting resolved, and you can feel the weight of everything finally moving toward the climax. Unfortunately, this is also where the real-world story takes an extremely tragic turn. In 2006, Jordan was diagnosed with a terminal illness, and in a very heartbreaking move, he kind of documented this entire process with fans in blogs. But instead of stepping away, he spent his remaining time writing extensive notes, outlining the entire ending and dictating how the story should conclude. He very commendably spent his little time left making sure that the Wheel of Time would not be left unfinished, and he would even go as far as have his assistants or wife at his bed dictating notes, which is just heartbreaking, but again, extremely commendable. Robert Jordan passed away in 2007, leaving behind a monumental amount of material, but not a fully finished manuscript. His wife and editor, Harriet McDougall, who had quite their own career in editing, actually editing Ender's Game as well, but anyway, she had a huge decision to make. Who could possibly step in and finish a series this massive without absolutely butchering it? And this, of course, brings us to Brandon Sanderson. Now, Sanderson wasn't just some random fantasy author who got handed the keys to the kingdom. He was picked specifically because of his deep respect for Jordan's work, and he allegedly first read The Eye of the World when it first came out when he was 14. Now, importantly, he wasn't trying to rewrite the ending or slap his own spin on things. His job was to take the absolute mountain of notes, which Jordan was famous for, and actually make them print-worthy, which he described the process as like someone handing him a smashed up, beautiful, intricate vase and asking him to put it back together. Now, obviously, that was no small task, and Brandon was well aware of this, and himself acknowledged that he was very, very close to turning down the offer because of just how daunting this actually was. Now, originally, the plan was to wrap up everything in one final book, but this turned out to just be impossible, and instead, the final stretch got split into 3 books, with the last one, as I mentioned, being one giant, non-stop, clench your fist, throw the book against the wall, and hype climax. Now, when the decision was originally made to split the ending into 3 books, there was some pushback from fans and accusations that this was just milking Jordan's life work for more money. But honestly, the way things turned out was pretty much as well as anyone could have possibly hoped for given the situation. Was it perfect? No. But in the grand scheme of things, Sanderson nailed it. The final 3 books still feel like Wheel of Time, and Sanderson respected Jordan's vision. Was it the exact ending Jordan himself would have written? Probably not, but it was as close as we're ever going to get, and for a job that was near impossible, Sanderson seemingly pulled it off. But if you think we're done, oh no, we are not even close, because there is a whole treasure trove of extra material. Prequels, short stories, companion books, deep lore dives, you name it, it's there. And if you ever finish the main series and find yourself staring at the wall wondering what to do with your life, good news, there's plenty more Wheel of Time content to drown yourself in. First up is New Spring, the prequel novel. Now, when exactly you should read New Spring is a matter for some debate, and the reason for this is that it has mild spoilers for later events in the stories. Nothing that will completely ruin the series, but enough that it might reframe certain things before you get there naturally. That said, it's an interesting read that gives a lot of insight into how Moraine first learned about the Dragon Reborn and how she met and bonded Lan as her warder. Is it necessary to enjoy the main series? Not really, but it's a solid companion piece. Outside of New Spring, there are a handful of short stories that expand the world even further. The Strike at Shia Ghul is set thousands of years before the main series, and then there's River of Souls taking place in Shara, which is also interesting because it was a cut chapter from A Memory of Light, and same with A Fire Within the Ways, although this one is considered non-canon. There's also a little odd one out called Ravens, which was included in the YA edition of The Eye of the World. Instead of the usual prologue, it has a new one featuring a young Egwene. Now, if you're the type of person who loves deep lore, there are also multiple Wheel of Time companion books floating around. The world of Robert Jordan's The Wheel of Time, sometimes called the Big White Book of Bad Art, was published in 1997 and contains a mix of world-building details, maps, and background lore, and as a nice touch, it was written in universe. There's also the reference book, The Wheel of Time Companion, which was published in 2015 after the series was finished. This one is basically a giant glossary covering every named character, location, and concept in the entire series. If you're doing a reread and need to check some obscure minor character, this book has got you covered. Now, one of the more recent additions is Origins of the Wheel of Time in 2022, which goes into the real-world inspirations behind the Wheel of Time. It also covers a lot of behind-the-scenes history of how the series was written, including material from Jordan's personal notes, which is fascinating stuff to see. So, one of the highest selling, most prolific, and longest running fantasy series in history has to have a ton of adaptations, right? Well, in this golden age where everyone is chasing the next Game of Thrones, surely Wheel of Time has been milk dry for TV, movies, games, and everything in between. Well, yes, but also no. Compared to some fantasy franchises, cough cough Discworld, that have adaptations spilling out of every orifice, the Wheel of Time is actually somewhat manageable in terms of what's out there. But don't get me wrong, there are some real weird little offshoots. But of course, the absolute grenade elephant explosion in the room is of course the Amazon TV series. Now, you might think the Amazon adaptation came out of nowhere. but the road to getting any version of the Wheel of Time on screen was messy. As far back as the early 2000s, Jordan himself mentioned that NBC had optioned the Eye of the World for a mini-series, which obviously did not happen. Then Universal Pictures got involved at one point, and at another point, a Japanese animation studio was interested in making an anime. And let's just take a second to imagine a Berserk-style Wheel of Time anime, because that would have been amazing. Anyway, if all of that sounds like a mess, this was just a primer for what was to come, because the Wheel of Time spent decades bouncing around studios caught in a tangled web of lawsuits and failed projects. If you want a full timeline of the development hell, I'll link it below, but to make a long and complicated story short, this thing was stuck in limbo for pretty much as long as the Wheel of Time series itself. Until, finally, it landed on Amazon's doorstep in 2018. And keep in mind that this was during the absolute heyday of Game of Thrones mania. Amazon had seen the numbers and they wanted their own giant nerd-driven fantasy hit. And for fans, this was the dream, a high-budget, serious adaptation of the Wheel of Time, and not just any adaptation, a massive blockbuster-level TV show. This is the kind of thing that every fandom wants for their beloved book series. But now we get to the question, well, how actually was it? Well, as the saying goes, the wheel weaves as the wheel wills, and god if the wheel's will isn't complicated. Now, to say that this show divided the fandom would be the understatement of all understatements, and it was incredibly divisive to the point that this day some of the top comments in all the various Wheel of Time Reddits are arguing for or against it. Now, obviously, this is a TV adaptation. 1 hour episodes, 8 episodes per season, which is nothing compared to the actual books, which can take anywhere from 29 to 42 hours per book to get through. So yes, of course, some things needed to be condensed. But here's the thing, this isn't just a case of trimming down scenes. There are some fundamental core changes to the very fabric of what makes Wheel of Time, well, Wheel of Time. For example, major shifts in relationships, different character arcs, and Rand getting pushed aside in favor of other storylines. And to steal a comment I saw on Reddit, quote, maybe it's a good show, but that's not the Wheel of Time, end quote. Now, that's not to say it's bad. A bad adaptation and a bad show are two different things, but let's be real. If you're a longtime fan of the books, the first 2 seasons can be rough. That said, there are definitely things to like in here. Most of the casting is solid, the production value is mostly high, and the sense of scale is genuinely impressive. But you can tell that the first 2 seasons were still figuring some things out. The show didn't just have to handle the sheer weight of Jordan's story, it also had to, deal with a global pandemic because that was happening then as well. That all being said, season 3 does seem to be finding its footing. Is it perfect? Absolutely not, but it feels more confident and more authentic, and you have to wonder if things keep improving, where could the show go? However, that is of course assuming that Amazon doesn't pull the plug, because there have been rumors that season 3 might be the last. But with the season currently ongoing, I guess we're going to see. And even if the TV show isn't your thing, well, why not make your own adaptation? Well, no, you probably can't fund your own TV show unless you are in fact Jeff Bezos, but you can do the next best thing, grab some dice and get that imagination to work. Because we got the Wheel of Time role-playing game in 2001. Released by none other than Wizards of the Coast, this was a Dungeons & Dragons style game with its own 300-page rulebook and adventure module, Prophecies of the Dragon. Jordan himself wrote the foreword, and the art is stunning. You can play as an Aiel, even an Ogier. Unfortunately, Wizards of the Coast didn't continue releasing products, citing issues with the storyline. But if that's not enough role-playing stuff for you, don't worry, because we are not nearly done yet, because I cannot go on without mentioning the muds of the Wheel of Time. Now, if you aren't in the know, I'm of course talking about the time-honored multi-user dungeon. What is that, you ask? Well, it's an interactive text-based game online, which were really popular back in the day. And the largest of these, the Wheel of Time MUD, is officially sanctioned with personal permission to operate from Jordan and is still active with a great interface, and I'll link it below. Now, speaking of games on your computer, well, I hear you screaming at me, where the are the video games? I mean, come on, there's got to be a game out there where you can channel and throw balefire at Trollocs and Dark Friends, right? Well, yes, I guess. The Wheel of Time game released in 1999, but what do you think would be the best format for a Wheel of Time video game? An RPG? A strategy game? Well, for the zero amount of you out there who said a first-person shooter, you get your very own Foxhead medallion from Matt, because that's exactly what we got. It actually had decent production value, and you do get to blast Trollocs with magic, so there's definitely fun in that. It's a bizarre take, but there's definitely a certain charm to it. But will there ever be more video games? I mean, come on, it would be awesome to have a Baldur's Gate style game. I'm not even talking about Baldur's Gate 3. Even a Baldur's Gate 1 style game would be amazing. Well, it's not like there's been nothing. There were plans for a Wheel of Time MMO RPG by none other than EA Games and Obsidian in 2009, but very sadly, the project was dropped in 2014. Now, if video games aren't your thing, you've got plenty of other Wheel of Time adaptations to dive into. In 1999, there was a collectible card game that had a strong Magic the Gathering vibe, and if you've still got some of these cards laying around, well, hats off to you. As for comics, the Dable brothers published an adaptation of The Eye of the World in 2009, and the art style, well, that's always going to be subjective. Everyone has their own preference, but say what you will, this was not some half-baked effort. It's full color with a solid amount of detail and over 30 issues adapting just the first book. They really took the time fleshing it out. And there was actually another adaptation before this, The New Spring, which was launched in 2004. Now, you'll see these referred interchangeably as comics and graphic novels, but to be clear, there's just one set. The confusion comes from the fact that all the comic issues were later collected into 6 hardcover edition novels, although these did eventually trail off. But somehow this wasn't the end. In a bizarre twist, a literal decade later, Dynamite picked up the reins and continued right where the first adaptation left off, The Great Hunt. Now, heads up, I have not been able to get my hands on these or see too much of them, but they are from a completely different creative team and the art style is noticeably different. Dare I say, more modern? If you've read them, I'd love to know what you think and if they're better or worse than the originals, but as far as I can tell, this run is still ongoing with the most recent issue dropping in 2024. So, wow, that was quite the journey and finally brings us to the present. And that brings us to the question, what's going on with the Wheel of Time right now? Well, the biggest thing without a doubt is of course the TV show, but the future of the show is a big old question mark. Unlike the first 2 seasons, which got renewed ahead of time, Amazon hasn't given season 4 the green light yet. That means that season 3 is going to be a huge test for the show's staying power. If it doesn't bring in the numbers Amazon wants, they might not be willing to keep betting on such an expensive production. On the book side of things, well, the main series is of course done, but there's been some interesting chatter about what could come next. There have been rumors, just rumors mind you, that Tor might be exploring the idea of a new Wheel of Time prequel. Now, nothing is confirmed, although crucially it should be mentioned that 4 years ago, Sanderson has gone on record saying that he himself will not write any more Wheel of Time books. But even if we don't get a full-fledged novel, Wheel of Time companion books and anniversary editions are still seemingly rolling out. And if you're into adaptations outside of TV, the Wheel of Time is also making moves in the tabletop gaming world. Direwolf recently announced a new Wheel of Time game, which honestly looks pretty cool, and I'll link it below. And of course, as for the fandom, yeah, you best believe it's still there. And in fact, instead of receding, as you might imagine, by all intents and purposes, it seems to be growing like a lot. There are multiple Wheel of Time subreddits, and by most standards, they are massive. You'll find everything from deep lore discussions to some of the most incredible fan-made maps, artwork, and theories out there. Seriously, some of the art people are making for this is just stunning, with some really unique takes on characters, iconic moments, and scenes that look like they all belong in a high-budget animated adaptation. And it's not just art. There's fan fiction, fan-made tabletop RPGs, even full-on fan films. There's also, of course, fan websites and communities, with probably the most prominent being Dragonmount, which even has a podcast as well. And it's just amazing to see how much creative energy is still being poured into this series years and years after the final book was released. And if that's not the mark of a truly beloved fantasy world, I don't know what is. And I think that all goes to show that the Wheel of Time is way more than just a fantasy series. It's practically a cornerstone of the genre. When it first hit shelves, fantasy was still living in Lord of the Rings shadow, but Wheel of Time cracked that wide open. It took classic tropes, spun them in new directions, and told a story that felt bigger, deeper, and more alive than anything else at the time. For a whole generation, this wasn't just a series, it was a journey, and a personal one at that. Readers grew up alongside Rand, Matt, and Perrin, watching them struggle, fail, grow, and become something greater in ways that probably mimicked their own lives. And over the decades, it shaped the way modern fantasy is written, inspiring everyone from George R.R. Martin to, of course, Brandon Sanderson, and leaving its fingerprints on countless other books that came after. So the question is, of course, why? Why has it lasted and become so influential? Is it the massive scope, the way it pulls you from a tiny village into a war that spans the entire world? The way it breaks down and rebuilds fantasy tropes while still delivering exactly what fans love about the genre? Well, maybe all of the above and much, much more. But at its core, The Wheel of Time is a story about fate, about how we're all caught up in something bigger than ourselves. And if there's one thing that this series has proven, it's that no matter how many years pass, how many books come and go, or how many adaptations rise and fall, the wheel will just keep on turning. Thank you so much for watching. I want to give an enormous shout out to everyone who helped me fact check from the incredible Wheel of Time communities out there. It's a massive series to go through, and it's really great to be able to talk to other fans of the series and bounce ideas off of you. And again, if you're interested, I really recommend checking out World of Warships and to use the code HEADLESS to get some nice free goodies. No shout out is ever complete without shouting out my incredible patrons who make this channel possible. Thank you. If you want to find out more ways to support me, you can check out the links to my Patreon in the description below. As always, if you ever have any suggestions about what you want me to cover next, please drop a comment and let me know. It's always really interesting to hear what you guys have to say. Anyway, thanks so much, and I'll see you next time. Bye.